completely volunteer-based organization. We're always looking for enthusiastic volunteers to get involved and help our cause. If you're interested, please email us at info@kalamazoowild.org. We hope to see you soon at an in-person event or webinar meeting soon. With that, I'll turn it over to Paul Alexia to introduce tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Jason. I think it's very rare for individuals to be considered living legends, but to my way of thinking, our speakers this evening fully fulfill that capacity. Some of you may not be quite so familiar with Tyler Bassett, but you may recall that Tyler spoke at the January Zoom session we had honoring Tom Small. Tyler is employed by the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, a premier ecological research facility. His research interests are in oak woodlands and their restoration. But Tyler is more widely known for the gift that he has for recognizing such a wide variety of host plants. If he sees a plant for the first time, he can give you a name on it. His modest demeanor very often belies his tremendous botanical knowledge. No one knows more about plants that I know of. Tom Small, our other speaker, needs no introduction this evening. He's widely recognized as an environmental activist, an ecological restoration, and a grower of native plants. All of us have benefited from knowing Tom and having him available to us through his talks, through his writing, through the Spring Plant Exchange, and so many other wonderful things that he does. Tom is the reason why many of us do the things that we do and think the way we think about things. If there were more Tom Smalls in the world, it would be a much better place. But you didn't join this Zoom session this evening to hear me. You joined it to hear our speakers, and I've already taken up more than their time than I wanted to. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce to you Tom Small and Tyler Bassett.
Thanks so much, Paul, for raising the bar. I hope I live up to my introduction. Thank you so much. That's very kind. So I'm going to be giving the first half of this presentation and then handing it off to Tom, hopefully around halfway through. Let's see here. First of all, are we all seeing the screen? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody?
Yes, we are.
Okay, thanks. Didn't want to go any further if we had to clear that up. Okay, so the name of this dual talk is the Once and Future Oak Ecosystems, Restoring the Culture. So there's a lot of meat in that. Almost every word brings some meaning. So let me just sort of break it down a little bit. I'll be discussing the natural history of oak ecosystems. So when we look around us, you know, the places where oaks dominate and structure the landscape historically and thankfully still sometimes presently. Describing what I mean by that, a little bit of a touching on to how humans and ecosystems have always been kind of connected, at least in this part of the world, although Tom's going to get into way more of that stuff. I'll discuss the management and restoration of oak ecosystems, and including some research that I've been involved with regarding that. And then I'll conclude by discussing, you know, hopefully you know, it sinks its teeth into you as it has for me, and you'll want to do something to make a positive impact. So we'll talk about that as well. And then I'll hand it off to Tom to dig into more of the cultural history of humanity's relationship with oaks, the nature and character of oaks themselves, some discussion of the history of clear cutting of these ecosystems, like why, how we used to find them extremely useful and still do in some ways for warfare and development. Some of the cultural history that's wound around oak species around the world and through history. And then some uplifting messages at the end regarding possible recovery and return to some of what we feel we have lost. Excellent. So first of all, what are oak ecosystems? So I'll start just by saying a few things about oak, the genus. So the genus of oak is Quercus. It's, as far as genera go, it's a pretty diverse one, and it's found on all continents except for Antarctica and Australia, in the temperate parts of the world. And there are a total of 435 species of oaks, which is, that's pretty big for a number of species for a genus. As you can see from the figure, the sort of the dendrology, the tree, the dendrogram on the right, that kind of shows where the different like subgroups of oaks are distributed. So there's definitely some diversity with regards to that. But as you can see, it's all pretty much along the temperate parts of the world. As far as getting closer to home, there's 255 of those species occur in the New World, in North and South America. And then closer to home in Michigan, we do have 11 native species. And what's interesting about oaks is that everywhere you find oaks, every part of the world where you find them, you can find them in a diversity of ecosystems. So from the lower part of that image kind of demonstrates how on the left, the lower wetland types all the way up to the highest and driest places. And a lot of the diversity of oaks is distributed across those habitats everywhere that they're found. So first of all, that's just some cool basic science about oaks. They're fascinating and very successful as a genus. So I'll be focusing on our part of the world, specifically, Eastern North America. And this is the range map for white oak, Quercus alba. And so the white oak is sort of the dominant species in a lot of the upland. So not the wetland, but the upland oak ecosystems in Eastern North America. It's a bit of a, standard bearer, if you will. And where there is white oak, there are upland oak ecosystems. And then as you can see at the base of the tree at the right, there's tons of associated species that come with that. So it's not just oak, it's the entire ecosystem. And I'll dig into that in some detail as much as we can in the short time we have. So when we talk about upland oak dominated ecosystems, we're talking about a pretty wide swath of sort of environmental conditions. First of all, oak ecosystems are often associated with generally treeless areas, which we just call prairie. But oak ecosystems cover this gradient from fairly open savannas to closed canopy forests. At least historically, that's the variation we used to see across the landscape. And looking at Kalamazoo County, so this is Kalamazoo County. This is the vegetation circa 1800. Some of you are familiar with this map, but this is our best guess at the vegetation that covered a particular area, in this case, Kalamazoo County, around the time when Europeans were heavily colonizing this part of the country. And so you can see how these different oak ecosystems, from the associated prairies all the way through the savannas and black oak barrens and oak hickory forests, occurred on the landscape in a sort of ever-changing mosaic, is how it's often thought. And of course, occurring with other habitat types too, and like include beech maple forest, which is not an oak ecosystem at all. It's sort of, the landscape was extremely variable, and oak ecosystems kind of formed across that variation. And there's a big reason for a lot of that variation, and this is one of them. So one of the things that ties oak ecosystems together and why it's associated with prairie is because they're all structured by fire historically, and if to the extent that they persist into the present and into the future, fire is going to be an important component of that. As you can see the picture on the top, you may notice some dark shading on some of those trees. This is an area at Fort Custer Training Center where a particularly successful fire happened a few years ago, and this is sort of the result. You can see some very, very green in the understory, and I'll touch on that several times. So we know that fire has always been a part of these oak ecosystems, in part because when Europeans were staking their claims in this part of the world, they were writing things down and telling the stories. And so, for example, here's a quote from 1835. "Today, for the first time, I saw the meadows on fire. They are burnt over thus annually to make it tender. These fires, traveling far over the country, seize upon the largest prairies and consuming every tree in the woods except the hardiest, cause the often mentioned oak openings, so characteristic of the Michigan scenery." So many people are familiar with the term oak openings, and it was quite popular at the time when there were a lot more oak openings left to be talking about. So not only does it make the grass tender for game to eat and whatnot, but every species associated with oak ecosystems is responding to that fire. So here's an example of a small savanna species called lead plant that many of you probably have in your yards. Kind of, you can see the density of leaf litter. It's in a lot of shade. It's kind of wimpy. It's not expressing itself. It's full of vitality. But here, after fire opens up the canopy a little bit, it can respond very quickly in a single year. It goes from a very wimpy thing with, however, a really dense root system to something that's upright and extremely large and blooming. So it's evolved with the fire. So another thing that fire helps to create in oak ecosystems is an open understory. So when I say two-tiered, I mean there's the stuff growing on the ground layer vegetation, which you can see here is very dense, and then there's the trees up above, so only two layers. There's also variation in oak ecosystems that involve a moderate amount of shrub layer, and that often includes hazel and huckleberry and sometimes oak sprouts until the next fire comes along and knocks it all back. And when you think about forests, you often think about a dense layer of leaf litter, but because of the fire, oak ecosystems have a dense herbaceous understory instead. It burns up the leaf litter, and also the species that occur in these fire adapted ecosystems are also fire adapted. So every time a fire comes through, they respond, grow a little bit bigger, and take advantage of that available space. Just a few pictures of what the environment looks like in different types of oak ecosystems across that kind of variant from open savanna to closed canopy forest. What you see in this picture, and at least the next one, is a very variable light environment. So areas where there's shade, an area where there's full sun. And because of that variation in light environments, there's a lot of diversity in plant species in the ground layer of oak ecosystems. Here's another kind of showing the dappled nature of the light. And this is highly characteristic of an oak ecosystem that is being managed, especially with fire, that creates some of those openings in the canopy and subcanopy. And here's just a few examples, just to give you some visual, I think of it as eye candy, but just visual stuff to so you know what I'm talking about a little bit better. And if we could spend some time with each one of these pictures and there's another species, there's another species, there's another species. There's incredible diversity, and it's more green than it is brown and leaf colored, if you will. There's also I am a botanist, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are animals that are associated with these systems and many of them are rare. So red-headed woodpecker is a fantastic, very much sort of not a keystone, but a flagship species of open oak ecosystems, and really likes that fire. Carner blue butterfly, more of a savanna species. There's a bunch of butterflies. Frosted elephant is another one. There's a ton of these things, and a lot of these species are rare because the lack of fire in the landscape is leading to a closed canopy condition that they don't prefer. I'll get more into that in a sec. And then eastern box turtle is another one that it's one of the only terrestrial turtles, almost entirely terrestrial. So, and they really love these open ecosystems. They move through them a lot better. Okay, so hopefully I've given enough of an overview. I could talk about bullet one there for quite a long time, but we don't have quite a lot of time, so I'll move on. Just to give some touchstones on, I was talking about the non-human parts of these ecosystems, but humans have been connected to these ecosystems as long as they've existed, and that is primarily been Native Americans. And that fire component is linked to the way that Native Americans managed the landscape that they lived in, as well as most indigenous cultures around the world use fire to increase sight lines, to corral game, several reasons. But fire is a major component of that culture. And the reason that the oak ecosystems and other fire-dependent ecosystems on this continent became the way they were, and the reason they're full of fire-adapted species that, now that we generally suppress fire, those are the species that are generally having a hard time finding a place to grow. And then Europeans came upon this fire-adapted landscape, and it affected the way that we settled the landscape, which I think is super fascinating. So this quote, most of the earliest land claims by settlers in this county were prairie, but also always at the edge, which was basically oak savanna. So as the prairie graded slowly with more and more trees into savanna and then forest, that was an ideal place for first settlements, because there was the open prairie that could be farmed, but you need trees for so many things, especially in those times. So here's just a couple examples back to this vegetation circa 1800 map. The first settlers in Kalamazoo County, and the second. Love that guy's beard. So here's where they settled on the edges of Genesee Prairie and Prairie Ronde there. And further, if you look at some of the old cemeteries in Kalamazoo County, you find that they occur, there's cemeteries there because people were there a long time ago. And so these are some of the oldest cemeteries in the county, and they're all on the edges of prairies, as that sort of pattern would suggest. And a lot of the cities in the county, the earliest cities, were settled on these prairies as well. So let's talk about that's the history of these oak ecosystems. Let's talk about the present and what we can do to manage and restore them. And so again, you can't get away with avoiding fire in these ecosystems. And there's lots of quotes like this. I'm not going to read this one, but it just sort of emphasize that it's an integral part. And without that fire, these ecosystems have changed pretty dramatically. So here's an open oak savanna in Kalamazoo County. This is what things used to look a lot more like. This is what things look like generally now. So this is a more common sight in remnant oak ecosystems in all of the eastern US. So we've kind of lost a lot of that variation. We may have somewhat, what you might call woodland, but most of it is pretty close canopied. So what used to be a very diverse and variable landscape is far less. And the reason that is this process that, as of 2008, we refer to as mesification. And this schematic kind of shows how that works. So first, you take fire out of the ecosystem, the canopy closes in, and then there's more shade. And then the species that can grow in those conditions expand. And so that's the term we use is mesophytic. And then those mesophytic trees create an environment that's suitable for them and not for oaks, and really suppresses oaks through the buildup of leaf litter and a cool, humid microclimate, which oaks and all these fire-adapted species are not happy about. And if you kind of look up in most mesophyte forests, you see something like this with a bunch of maple. Red maple and cherry are the main sort of aggressors in this. They're native species, but we've kind of changed the rules, and they're doing a lot better than they were historically in the absence of fire. And as far as, okay, what do we do about it? So people that have been doing this work for a long time, and people that have been researching this work across the eastern U.S. Have tried different techniques. So some people have just tried fire. Some people have decided that you need to get in there and actively remove some of those mesophytic trees in order to get light down to the ground layer. Because if you noticed on that mesophication slide, that humid microclimate is not compatible with fire. So if you try to burn a mesophytic forest, sometimes it just doesn't work. It's too moist. The fire doesn't carry. So let me talk about a couple research projects. So this first one is an experimental restoration at McCready Reserve in Jackson County, Michigan. Michigan State University owns it. Lars Brodvig and Doug Landis established this experiment in 2010, and it's managed by MSU staff. Basically, they identified what was a remnant savanna along this ridge on the left image, which is an image from 1938. And as you can see, it's a very variable sort of dark gray, light gray, and that suggests some trees, some openings, some trees, some openings. Whereas if you look at the picture on the right, it's pretty much just forest. And so they instituted this experimental restoration to compare some of those different management techniques. And that's what the yellow outlines are, different experimental units. So, and the different environmental units were either unmanaged, so nothing, and you can see how shady that is. Burn only, so just using fire every 2 to 3 years, and then units where, in addition to the fire, there's mechanical thinning, so chainsaws getting in there and cutting some trees. And from the figure on the top right, so that's an analysis done after 9 years of this experiment. And you can see that in the thin and burn treatments, diversity, in this case, the number of species per plot, is 60% greater than the unmanaged. Whereas you can see the burn only is somewhere in the middle. So that really adds some weight to the idea that, you know, needing to thin in addition to burn to reverse that mesification process. So following up on that research and the other slide where I showed, you know, similar research from lots of, you know, states in the eastern U.S., this group kind of got together, and I was a part of this group as well. I don't have time to give accolades to everybody, but I want to put their faces up here. And we located 28 different locations like that McCready Reserve. So McCready plus 27 other places across the Southern Great Lakes Basin, and sampled 100 different plots across that area. And yes, that is a lot of plots. And so at each of those locations, we tried to identify at least one of each of these treatments. So in addition to the thin and burn and the unmanaged controls, we also tried to include one with no burning but thinning, so we could tease apart some of those dynamics a little bit better. So the purpose of doing this at such a large scale is to sort of test for how universal is this pattern that a lot of people have seen, saying that, you know, thinning and burning is way more effective than just burning alone. And what we found was it sort of underlined what, you know, a lot of managers are seeing, and what a lot of the individual research projects are seeing is, again, the combination of thinning and burning is more effective at restoring, in this case, diversity over the unmanaged than the other types of treatment. You know, burning is definitely effective, as you can see, but thinning and burning resulted in 85% greater diversity than the unmanaged controls, and burn only 60% greater. It's still pretty good, but the clock is ticking and we're losing that diversity when we're not managing. So the sooner the better. Additionally, we teased apart, I could talk for 2 hours about this data, because there's a lot I can get into, but this one particular thing we teased apart, which was, we calculated this prescribed fire intensity metric, which takes into account both how many times a site had been burned and over what period of time. And so sites that have been burned more frequently over a longer period of time, like 3 decades instead of 1 decade, those also had higher diversity. So fire has an accumulative effect as long as you burn very frequently. So that's a good, if fires are your only option, you just keep doing it, stick with it. You're probably going to see some good results. And it shouldn't be surprising based upon our understanding of the role of fire in these ecosystems. So just to sum up, like how do we move from the situation on the top, which is common, which is these closed canopy oak ecosystems, to a more open canopied system, more similar to what was historically. Thinning and burning is preferential, and it does that by more quickly opening up the canopy to get light to the ground layer. It reduces leaf litter more effectively. It leads to higher diversity and changes in what species are growing at the ground layer, from woody species, so shrubs and trees, to green herbaceous vegetation. There's differences based upon the soil conditions at the site that I can't get into, but that's always, there's always something that throws a screwball and makes it a little bit complicated, and that's definitely a thing. And again, burning alone is effective, but it's a little bit slower process as far as we can tell. Okay, so hopefully you want to help. What can you do for the restoration of oak ecosystems? And by the way, this picture that we're looking at, I'm showing a lot of pictures. I haven't said much about where all of them are. This is it's a Dry Prairie Cemetery on Millam, and it's just full of big old oaks. So check out the oaks that are around a lot of these old cemeteries. So one of the best things you can do to help with the restoration of oak ecosystems is support the conservation work that's happening. So there's a lot of, I'll show on my next slide, there's a lot of folks doing the work. Several of you are doing it. Several of you are probably aware of some of the work that's going on in natural lands around Southwest and Southern Michigan. Support them. You can support them financially, and that's especially important because land acquisition is important. So if you don't own the land, you can't manage it. There's also opportunities to volunteer on crews fighting invasives, and if you want to get into fire management, you can, or you can just watch. So here's just a smattering of some of the groups doing the work around Southwest Michigan. Michigan Nature Association, the Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy. The DNR does a bunch of fantastic work, and they're always looking for help. Of course, the Nature Conservancy, Pierce Cedar Creek up in Berry County. The Kalamazoo Nature Center has a great crew and does great work. And Western Michigan University also, through their management of primarily the Asylum Lake Preserve, which is a historical oak ecosystem. And the other primary way that I would advocate for is just to educate yourself like you're doing tonight. Hopefully you're being educated right now. And so there's any number of ways to engage with education. I'll mention a demonstration garden that's in Southwest Midge Park, which is what this picture is right here in the Vine neighborhood of Kalamazoo. You can also just go to some of the sites that I'll mention some sites, and we'll do a field trip later this year too, just to get yourself in these places just to understand what the difference is between a managed and an unmanaged oak ecosystem. Because I've tried to explain it by the sort of, verbally, and by showing some pictures of what these places look like. And that's helpful, but it's you can't really get it unless you're in these places, and sensing the vitality. And also part of that education, one of the reasons that education is super important is because the majority of mature oak, dominated by white oak in particular, ecosystems are on private land in Michigan and throughout the eastern U.S. So the more people that understand what these slightly more subtle differences are, the more the conversations with neighbors can happen, and the more I feel like we could strengthen those kind of ties, and maybe more people will make different decisions on how to manage their oak ecosystem that they own. Tom's going to mention this, but I would be I also want to mention it, so I'll give my spin on it. So here's a demonstration garden that I helped to establish with money from the Nancy Small Memorial Fund and Wildflower Association of Michigan. I've circled it in red on this vegetation circa 1800 map. It's on Southwestnage in the Vine neighborhood, and as you can see, it's in what was historically this light tan color, which is mixed oak savanna. So historically, it was part of savanna. More recently, it was cemetery in the 1800s, the first cemetery in Kalamazoo. It's been a park for quite a long time, and it has the oaks, but it doesn't have anything else in the ground there except for turf grass. So put this planting together that we hope to expand. I'd love for people to get more involved in it, and have conversations about, I would like to put up a sign. The city's willing to pay for a sign that explains what it is. If somebody wants to jump in and help me design that sign, I'd really appreciate that, or any other help. And I'd love to have more work days where we expand. It's about 1,000 square feet right now, and want to keep expanding it into the future. So, and finally, fortunately, I haven't been paying attention to time. I hope we have time. Somebody tell me if we don't. But I just wanted to end with a sort of a quick virtual tour of some cool. So these are all the sites that I mentioned in that 28 sites, 100 plot study that I described. And I'm just going to show some pictures of some of these places, and I've circled them in yellow here. So here's Middle Fork Savanna in Lake County, Illinois, and this is one of the first oak savanna restorations ever, if not the first. If folks are familiar with the name Steve Packard and the Tallgrass Prairie Restoration Handbook, this was the site where it all started. It's a pretty incredible place that's been managed for a super long time, and so it kind of has all the hallmarks of that. Very diverse, and just kind of incredible. Kitty Todd Preserve near Toledo in Ohio it's close to us. It's a really cool spot. Kettle Moraine State Forest in southeast Wisconsin. It has a mixture of very kind of closed canopy forests all the way up to these sort of knobs with open vegetation. Many of you have experienced the Manistee National Forest. That's a sort of a drier savanna to woodland to forest area, as is, say, Allegan in Southwest Michigan. And then, of course, the McCready Reserve, where the follow-up field trip to this presentation will be taking place this summer. So, and this again to emphasize that this area is undergoing experimental restoration, so you can really see the differences as you move from the experimental unit to experimental unit. You can see with your eyes what the differences are. So I think it's a really cool opportunity as such. Excellent. So here's a bunch of pictures of oak trees as we transition to Tom's part of the talk.
Okay, Tyler, would you move on to the next slide, please? This is going to be a very kind of personal talk. I'm going to deal with some personal history and some cultural history. I think you can tell from Tyler's talk the extent of his knowledge and his expertise, and also his involvement, his personal passion for these ecosystems. So I hope I can match something of his passion in my own particular way. And I'm going to begin with an image that I used for many, many years in my teaching of Romantic literature and culture in the Romantic period in English literary history. And I'm going to begin with an image of, among other things, giant oak trees, and a poem by Thomas Gray called The Bard of 1757. Gray is perhaps better known for Elegy in a Country Churchyard, but The Bard was one of the great popular poems of his day. And in it, he spoke of the invasion of Wales and the conquest of Wales by King Edward I in the 13th century. And he traced kind of the development from that conquest of the turmoil and the bloodshed and the strife within the English monarchy. And the voice that we hear in the poem is the voice of the last bard of the Welsh people. And according to legend, Edward commanded the slaughter of all the bards, the poets, the kind of semi-shaman figures of the Welsh nation, because they could be subversive of his order and his rule and his conquest of the Welsh people. And here's an excerpt from the Bard and his speech to the troops of Edward I, winding down from their Welsh castle in pursuit of him. Hark, he says to them, how each giant oak and desert cave sighs to the torrent's awful voice beneath. O'er thee, O king, their 100 arms they wave. Revenge on thee in hoarser murmurs breathe. Be thine despair and sceptered care. To triumph and to die are mine. So this is the voice of prophecy. This is the voice of the prophecy of the future, and it's the voice not only of the bard, but of the oaks and the waters and the stones and the air, of all the elements. This is elemental power and force as opposed to the puny force of Edward's legions. And here is an image of freedom, of independence, of power, of energy, of the wild, of prophecy, of a kind of union of earth and heaven. Are we having difficulties here? And the Welsh bard there represents kind of the spirit of the place, with his harp and the eagles soaring above him, and he looks as if he's contoured with the rocks themselves and a part of them. And at the end of his prophecy, he hurls himself from the rocks into those waters, the flowing waters of the Welsh land. But he is going to be triumphant ultimately, because he will return and Edward will not. And Welsh culture will triumph. And Wales is gradually, slowly seceding now in the 21st century from the domination by the English. The next slide, please. The next oak that I'm going to talk about is the major oak in Sherwood Forest. Again, another image of power, of freedom, of wildness. This is the major oak, which according to legend was the gathering place for Robin Hood and his merry band of outlaws. Outlaws who had a justice of their own and a redistribution system of the wealth that represented a kind of anarchy and a kind of, as in the image of the Welsh, a kind of resistance of unjust and dominant and invasive authority. And John Keats, one of my favorite of English poets, I wrote both my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation on his poetry, commemorates that time which is past. All are gone away and past. And if Robin should be cast sudden from his turfed grave, and if Marian should have once again her forest days, she would weep and he would craze, he would swear, for all his oaks, fallen beneath the dockyard strokes, have rotted on the briny seas. And they have, because the oaks of England were cut in order to provide the wood for warfare, for the ships of the line, each one of which required 3,000 to 4,000 oaks for its construction and many, many more for its ongoing repairs. And they have now rotted on the briny seas. They are gone. Marian, the maid of Robin, would weep that her wild bees sang not to her. Strange that honey can't be got without hard money. That freedom of exchange, that living off the land has been replaced by a commercialized monetary economy. And Keats laments that. So it is, yet let us sing honor to the old bowstring, honor to the woods unshorn. And that legend, that wonderful legend of Robin Hood has had so many incarnations in our culture. There's just one of them in the upper right-hand corner, Errol Flynn as Robin Hood, and one of the more popular and enduring films of the Robin Hood legend and all that it stands for. Next slide, please. Here's another very significant oak representing freedom. The Wilberforce oak, under which in 1787, William Wilberforce informed Prime Minister William Pitt of his intention to bring forth a parliamentary bill to abolish slavery, which he did, according to promise. In 1791, it didn't pass. In 1792, it passed in a really watered down version that didn't mean anything. But in 1807, the slave trade was abolished in the British Empire. And Wilberforce was one of the forces that was responsible for that. The final abolition of slavery as such did not occur till 1837, but it was only 50 years after Wilberforce started his campaign. And here the image is of pilgrims gathered under the oak in 1872, pilgrims from all over the world, including Africa, including former slaves. And the man in the center is the first African bishop of Nigeria. And these pilgrimages were, there were so many of them. This is from an Edwardian era postcard. And again, I want to emphasize the association, cultural association of the oaks with these images of freedom and release from captivity and prophecy of a future that is greater than ourselves and what we now know. Next slide, please. Here I am on a pilgrimage to an oak forest in England, in this case, Wistman's Woods or Wise Man's Woods, not in Sherwood Forest, but on a large English preserve. And these woods are very strange. They're probably the oldest oak forest in England, and they preserve because of the stony ground that could never be plowed. And here we are resting in a downpouring rain. The objective of our pilgrimage, our walk on the moors. and just meditating together with our leader, Satish Kumar, the author of Earth Pilgrim. And we were taking a course from him called Earth Pilgrim to sacred places. And the Oaks have this kind of sacred culture that they're associated with. And I'm the person down in the lower left-hand corner with my Tilly hat. And these are the rest of my fellow pilgrims and students. Next slide, please. One of the great images, cultural images, from way back into prehistory on up through Greek and Roman and Renaissance, and even into our own local culture, is the image of Arcadia, or the pastoral state of human culture. And one of my cultural models, Jim Corbett, whom I'll talk about a little bit later, from the time man and woman tasted the fruit of knowledge and, becoming self-conscious, stepped out of nature into history, we have dreamed of the age when we were or will be at peace with all that lives. That place before and beyond exile has always been the object of poetry, and it is called Arcadia. And you see an image of it here, which is, interestingly, a kind of savanna-like image of under vegetation and a scattering of trees. And this is the second of a series of paintings by Thomas Cole, the American painter of the Hudson River School, one of the founders of that school of painting. And he painted a whole series, beginning with the savage state, the hunter-gatherer state, the second state, the Arcadian or pastoral state, everything at peace, the peace of the peaceable kingdom, of the peaceable land with shepherds, goat herds, song and dance and love and poetry and freedom from arbitrary rule, freedom from rents or leases or any kind of commercial economy where everybody lived at peace with and on the land. The three further stages of empire, as Cole painted them, are pretty horrific, and they end prophetically in absolute collapse and destruction. But the ideal and the enduring dream is of Arcadia. Next slide, please. Here is a kind of different version of Arcadia from Nicolas Poussin, the French painter, 17th century. This is a painting dating from about 1637, 38. And it's a follower of the original painting of Arcadian shepherds, that's the title, or Et in Arcadia Ego. I also am in Arcadia. And the Arcadian shepherds are looking thoughtfully and a little melancholy, perhaps, at a skull and a tombstone. And so even in Arcadia, even in the ideal state, there is death, there is decay, there is corruption. Here in Poussin's more classical kind of painting, the shepherds are simply reading the tombstone, Et in Arcadia Ego, and looking thoughtfully, interestedly, one of them looking back at this kind of presiding female figure of perhaps wisdom and perspective on it. And again, we have the same kind of landscape as in Cole's later 19th century painting of a kind of open landscape with a scattering of trees and a kind of savanna. Next slide, please. Here's another manifestation of that myth of Arcadia in Don Quixote and the Impossible Dream. And the image on the right is a carving, an olive wood carving of Don Quixote with his book, and perhaps a kind of reminiscence of Miguel de Cervantes, the creator of Don Quixote. And the carving was given to me by my then stepson, who brought it to me, carved of Spanish olive wood. from the Canary Islands that he had visited. And that's one of my cultural treasures. The image in the center is Picasso's image of the Man of La Mancha, and a book jacket illustration on the left. Don Quixote's last dream, as he lies upon what is to be his deathbed, says, calling myself the herdsman Quixotes, and you the herdsman Pancino, we will wander among the peaks, the forests, and the meadows, singing here, lamenting there, drinking of the spring's crystal waters, or from the unpolluted creeks, or from the rushing rivers. We will be provided with sweet fruit in abundance by the oaks, chairs by the trunks of hardy cork trees, shade by the willows, perfume by the roses, carpets of 1,000 interwoven colors by the spacious meadows, breath by the clear and pure streams. I can't read the last line of this, so I don't remember from memory exactly what it says, but it is Don Quixote's last dream after he has returned from all his nightly errantry in adventures. And Sancho, a little later, responds, look, he says to Don Quixote, don't be lazy. Get up out of bed. Let's go to the country dressed as herders. The way we decided, maybe behind some bush, we'll find the lady Dulcinea, disenchanted, if we just look. So even Sancho, the flesh, the laggard with his donkey, is ready to go on the final dream, the last impossible dream of the recovery of Arcadia and the oak savanna, and they will become herders, goat herders, sheep herders. They will live now the life disenchanted of all of its corruption, and the myth of Arcadia will live again in the Man of La Mancha. Next slide, please. One of the great herders that I have ever encountered, one of the most impressive people I've ever encountered, is Jim Corbett, whom I quoted earlier on. Called himself Don Quixote with glasses. He, to friends who were meeting him, or strangers who were meeting him in airports, he'd say, just look for Don Quixote with glasses, you'll find me. And they always did. He saw himself as a goat walker. He lived as a goat walker for a long period of his life in the desert. He was the founder of the sanctuary movement. He was so successful at being a desert survivor, a desert wanderer with his goats, that he traveled the desert, Mexican and Arizona and New Mexico deserts, looking for lost refugees from El Salvador and Guatemala, and leading them to sanctuary churches. And his goat walking book is a guide to wildland living, a quest for the peaceable kingdom. He called himself an errant troubadour. That is, he identified with the myth of Arcadia and the Arcadian troubadours, the finders, the singers, the poets, living from the gifts of those who store up and share earthly treasures, such as oaks, goats, and the earth. He invites us to take a step into legendary Arcadia and become a plain member and citizen of the land community, quoting Aldo Leopold. And the image on the left is of Corbett on the left in his glasses, carrying a refugee El Salvadoran child and escorting El Salvadoran refugees across the Rio Grande River, which he did over and over and over again, being put on trial but acquitted by the US government. Next slide. We have lost our ancient culture of oaks and acorns, on which our ancestors from prehistoric times largely lived. And here's a kind of idealized image of California Indians and the lost culture of acorns. And here is a early 20th century image of a Yosemite Indian, one of the few remaining Yosemite Indians on the Yosemite Valley floor, still grinding acorns. And perhaps this is an undated photograph, and I don't know who exactly the woman is, but perhaps she is the legendary granddaughter of Tanaya, the last chief of the Yosemite, who did spend some time in the early 20th century in Yosemite as a kind of demonstration of ancient life. And she would be grinding acorns. And a tourist once offered her a nickel for an acorn, and she said, no, they are not for sale. They are not for sale. You are the conquerors, and this is the last of my heritage, and it's not for sale to you. Next slide, please. Getting closer still to home, Oak Openings, James Fenimore Cooper's novel of 1848, based on his visit to our area in 1847 and 1848, and to the Oak Openings, which he commemorated in the title and the text of his novel, based largely on Prairie Ronde in the Schoolcraft area and an ancient bee hunter who lived a kind of pastoral and Arcadian existence in the novel. And the image on the left lower is of the then in the 1830s and until it was transferred to Kalamazoo, the Federal Land Office in White Pigeon, kind of in the midst of oak savanna territory. And it was there that about 250,000 acres of Indian maintained oak savanna land was sold for $1.25 an acre until that kind of transaction was transferred to Bronson, which then became the city of Kalamazoo. Next slide. Here are some remnants or ghosts of Arcadia. You don't have to go very far in Kalamazoo to find the name Arcadia, still with its resonance, still with its heritage, but largely unknown to us. It's lost, as is virtually the culture of acorns. It's one of the lost words. It's even been dropped from the Oxford edition of the Junior Dictionary as a word that young people are not likely to encounter or need to know the meaning of. Acorn. Think of that. We're living among the ghosts of Arcadia. Arcadia Creek, which was supposedly liberated, and you see the result. Southwest Edge Park, which Tyler spoke of as a kind of remnant or simulacrum of an oak savanna. And there's a revenant, a return, a ghost, an image of part of Tyler's planting there on Southwest Edge Park. And there's Bronson Park from 1905. Again, a kind of savanna land. And Arcadia Beer, Arcadia Creek, Arcadia Festival Site, Arcadia Golf Course, the old golf course, which is now part of Western Michigan University. And by my count, at least 11 businesses in Kalamazoo that carry the name Arcadia were haunted by that ghost here of the past and of the dream. Next slide. But maybe there is some chance of recovery. The Native Americans are certainly aware of trying to recover their heritage of an acorn and oak culture, and even the landscape of the oak savannas that they maintained by fire for hundreds, thousands of years. And the Indians in California maintained right up until the time of the gold rush and even past. They would burn 18,000 acres a year, maintaining oak savanna and their acorn culture. The wildflowers in California, the wildfires in California in when? 20, 2021 burned only 5,000 acres, only about a third of what the Indians burned every year. We're getting to recovery and restoration. The Apache are trying to recover their sacred oak flat. Redwood Forest in Mendocino County, California, 537 acres of it, is now protected by the Siskiyone Indians, who were the original inhabitants of that wonderful forest. Recovery and restoration, protecting the land, recovering the sacred, transforming the culture of conquest and possession into the peaceable kingdom. Next slide, please. We're still doing it. Some of the Native Americans are still doing it. There's oak savanna on Walpole Island in the mouth of the St. Clair River. The First Nation, their unceded territory that they've been burning for hundreds of years to maintain what oak savanna they have. There are wonderful oaks on private property. And as Tyler tells you, there's still wonderful remnants and possibilities of recovery. So I want to draw towards a close with gratitude to the survivors, the preservers, and the restorers. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. The impossible dream. There's on the left, Jim Corbett, Don Quixote with glasses. And there on the right is my image, my cherished image of Don Quixote without glasses. And some of the words of Corbett that I heard when I met him in New Mexico. He was the guest for a Quaker meeting that we had there. He's a Quaker. To enter Arcadia, one must learn to commune with objects. Beneficial use must be subordinated to active worship. Errantry, and he saw himself as a troubadour, an errant kind of knightly figure, means sallying out beyond society's established ways to live according to one's inner leadings. This looks like, and in a sense, is madness, Quixote's madness. And along with Aldo Leopold, Corbett invokes Gandhi. And Gandhi followed, he says, the Quixote principle to open the way, a cultural breakthrough need not involve masses of people, but must be done decisively by someone in the quest for the peaceable kingdom. And Doug Tallamy, in a personal letter that I got earlier this year, we've been corresponding about oaks, says, wouldn't it be wonderful if someday we once again all worshipped oaks, and they were part of our culture and part of our impossible dream of Arcadia and living with the land in what Aldo Leopold invokes as the community, the full community of life. And Rebecca Solnit, in her new book, her recent book, just out, Orwell's Roses, tells us a garden is an ideal version of nature filtered through a particular culture. We have, in a sense, the echoes and the ghosts of Arcadia all around us. We have it in the landscape of Southwest Niche Park. We have it in much of the landscape of our whole urban and suburban area. It is, in a sense, savanna land. It's just very degraded and absent so many of the keystone species that Tallamy invokes as essential to our part of the world as the key to the land and to the culture. And it's the restoration of that culture as a way of life. It's the restoration of that culture as an ideal of simplicity, as an ideal of living with the whole community, not as conquerors, but as Aldo Leopold says, as plain citizens and members, part of the ecosystem to which, as part of our heritage, we belong. It doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. That's the lesson that we get from our Native American predecessors and who still are among us and surround us and can be, in some ways, our models. Thank you.
All right, Tyler and Tom, thank you both so much for your presentations and unique insights. It was very enlightening from two very special and unique perspectives.
So we do have a little bit of time for questions for either Tom or for Tyler. I see one question from the chat for Tyler. With the majority of white oak on private land, how can landowners manage their ecosystems and what resources are available?
So there is, and there's a couple groups that come to mind that I'm familiar with. There's something called the White Oak Initiative, which is part of the American Forest Foundation, and they have some funding. Specifically, it's everybody from whiskey distillers that need oaks for barrels to people that are managing for biodiversity. So that's one that comes to mind. But in Michigan too, you can work with the DNR. They have private lands programs, and so if you or your neighbor is interested in taking proactive steps to ensure the future of oak on the landscape, and you happen to have that resource in your ownership, you can the DNR will work with that, and can provide you those resources and guidance too, and best management practices. So,
thank you. Do you have a recommendation for a particular book or books?
Yeah. Well, there's one that people find pretty inspiring called "The Miracle of the Oaks" by William Stevens, I think is the author, and that describes. So I mentioned Middle Fork Savannah and Steve Packard. That kind of describes the history of, the recognition that Oak Savannah was a thing in a way, and so it's all volunteer-based management of Oak Savannah in the Chicago area, and I think it's there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from that. That's a really good one. Miracle of the Oaks.
Another question: is most of Kalamazoo City originally Oak Savannah?
Pretty much. Yep.
Another question is about Kleinstuck. Is that also?
I'd have to double check, but I mean pretty much all of the city of Kalamazoo was historically Oak Savannah. Yep. Or so anything from White Oak Savannah to the drier into the continuum that we refer to as Oak Barrens or Black Oak Barrens. It was a combination of those. So I think Kleinstuck was a bit more. You know how you're going up Westnedge Hill, and it's a lot of the hills tend to be sandier, and so I think it was probably more Oak Barrens. But yep.
And then finally, a question about whether smaller landowners who perhaps have less than an acre, is it helpful for them to plant oaks on their property?
I think it's helpful in the to the extent that can't bring back Oak Savannah per se or oak ecosystems per se, but unless the whole neighborhood's doing it. But what it can do is provide stop-off, like anything that folks do planting natives in the yard. It can provide stopover resources for, it can help connect the dots between larger patches of oak ecosystems that are on the landscape for sure.
So again, thank you to Tyler and Tom. Gail, if you'd like to put up the slide for next month's presentation. All right, so Wednesday, March 23rd, invasive jumping worms. That will be interesting, featuring Brad Herrick. Thank you all for joining tonight. Tyler and Tom, thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.